other schools. So I think it speaks to just this fear of the system. There's a disconnect somewhere between child welfare, the school district, and families. And so families are no longer, I don't want to generalize, but a lot of the families are no longer seeing this as something to help. It's more of a way that you're going to hurt me or take my child away from me. And so they're avoiding. And I think that those were some major players in why we saw the rates of utilization go down in 2016. So again, the other thing is I just want to, we came up with some recommendations, and one of the biggest recommendations is to have a multi-level approach to doing this work. So not just doing the school screenings, but also we found increased utilization when we educated the counselors on what healthy childhood sexual behavior looks like, because surprisingly, a lot of the counselors didn't know. I did a training with actually the middle and elementary school counselors in Philadelphia, and their eyes were kind of popping out of their heads when we would talk about just basic sexual behaviors in children. So I think that, as well as having some opportunities for parents to receive some education surrounding these behaviors, and then again giving the children some help and some follow-up would be the best approach, as opposed to just waiting to intervene after some problem behavior has been identified. And then making sure that we have ongoing connection with the school district. So as a result of them not having a lot of professional development days, they didn't have an opportunity to get education around this, or the focus is really about that academic rigor as opposed to all these other supports that are needed. So, and then, as Peter said, continued data collection and a more rigorous data collection. So thank you. And our contact information is here if you want to email us as well.
Thank you so much. And some of you may have burning questions, but in the interest of time, we'll save some of that for the open discussion afterwards, as well as following that, we'll have a panel discussion where I think we could definitely get into more of a dialogue framework. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Duvall-Flynn. Dr. Joan Duvall-Flynn is a retired career educator whose experiences encompass levels from preschool to graduate school. As a classroom teacher, observations of the impact of trauma and grief on school performance led her to complete a graduate degree in pastoral counseling with a clinical emphasis from Newman University in 1987. She has watched the rising impact of trauma as a public health issue over the past 30 years. In 2010, because of her work for the NAACP, Dr. Duvall-Flynn began serious study of the impact of emotional and psychological trauma on school performance, as identified through writings in the field of medicine, psychology, sociology, and juvenile justice. As a result, she organized experts to present on this issue at several conferences on the state of education in Pennsylvania, hosted annually by NAACP Media Area Unit with the support of Cheney University of Pennsylvania. In 2012, working with Chester County Senator Andrew Dinniman, Dr. Duvall-Flynn organized the Trauma-Informed Education Coalition, or TIEC, which has presented information workshops to educators, public school nurses, and other non-instructional support staff, and at a number of public forums. Dr. Duvall-Flynn has presented nationally on the topic of trauma as an impediment to school performance at conferences, including the 2012 National Association of Black School Educators Convention, the 2015 One Child, Many Hands Summit at the University of Pennsylvania, and for the Delaware Valley Minority Achievement Consortium. So she has done a great deal of work in this area of trauma-informed care in the schools, and I'd like to ask you to please join me in welcoming Dr. Duvall-Flynn.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to join this conference. So I'm supposed to find myself. Okay. I thought I was down there. I'm not down here. Was it modified? Yeah. Yeah. There it is. So how do I make it big?
It's big.
Oh, it's big in the back.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to be fairly quick and direct about what I'm here for because I have given up all energies except to get policy so that things can flow. Policy that says what'll be done and what money will support it. I'm just to that level now. So we have had some success. The NAACP and the Trauma-Informed Education Coalition called for trauma-informed education in Pennsylvania. We called for it on the Hill and in the valley, on the roads, on the sidewalks and in the alleys. We've screamed it and hollered it, and we did prevail. And so we got recommendations in the Pennsylvania Basic Education Funding Formula for the Secretary of Education to develop protocols for addressing trauma in schools. And we did by sending tons of research down to Senator Casey and Virginia Representative Bobby Scott, who were on the conference committee for ESSA. We got mention of trauma into ESSA. So there is money in ESSA for you. And so do a Google search on funding opportunities in Every School Succeeds Act. See how you can get money to follow your district's dreams about addressing this issue. It's in there. So the NAACP and TIEC recommend that districts introduce trauma as an impediment to school performance by introducing teachers to secondary trauma. And there's a reason for this. I spent my life in the classroom. Some of my students were 6, and some of them were 60, because I taught across education from preschool through graduate school. And what I have learned in training teachers and working with teachers is that everyone cannot in-service teachers. It is best for people who have been in the trenches to in-service teachers. In my career, some of the things that left me with secondary trauma: teaching students with mentally ill parents, students with chronically ill or mentally ill siblings, grief-stricken students, students who had parents on active duty in war zones, students who came to school hungry and didn't know if they were going to eat that night, students whose fathers had lost their incomes, homeless students who were hiding that fact, domestic violence students who lived in homes where there was domestic violence, and even to the point of 1 or 2 times one of the spouses murdering the other, students who had incarcerated parents, students who were re-traumatized by the school by being victims of very harsh punishment in the face of their trauma, students whose parents were divorced and using those kids for tag, children who had come here from war-torn countries. Those were the children that drained me. The ones that came to school high with a contact high and had to sleep all day, or sleep 3 or 4 hours. It wasn't always obvious child maltreatment. It was the other stuff that people do that happens to their kids that left me drained and with secondary trauma. So professionals involved in the care of traumatized children and their families often have this. First, we'll start with burnout. And burnout isn't always synonymous with secondary trauma. But we'll start with burnout, and we won't even know what secondary trauma is and that we're carrying it. We'll just know something's wrong with us. So when we go into the school to carry this message, if we start with the wounded healers, if we start with the adults who are carrying the pain of hundreds of kids, that will open them to the rest of it. That's our contention. That's what we think we've learned from working with teachers over a few years about this. So secondary trauma stress, it's that emotional duress resulting from exposure to the first-hand trauma. And teachers are different from therapists or physicians or other helping practitioners. We see our wounded people 25, 30 at a time. And all we do all day is diagnose and prescribe, whether it be why they can't read or why they just threw the chair. It's ongoing and never-ending, consistent and demanding. And so those symptoms mimic post-traumatic stress syndrome. Our supportive role with students is something beyond what most people outside the culture know or understand. Very few people who do not practice in the classroom know what we do. Very few people understand how much we have to know about how many things. I have been to NEA conventions, talked to teachers from across the United States, raised the issue of trauma, and from California to Maine, from New York State to the tip of Florida, they will all say, oh yeah, they're traumatized, we know that, you know? And so this is not going to be news to them, but what to do will be what's news to them. I have this piece of research here. It was the only published piece that I could find on secondary trauma, traumatic stress, and it was done by the RAND Corporation, the gentleman who spoke this morning. He and I had a good talk about it outside. I said, I can't find any other writing on this. There might be some, but I couldn't find. So here are some of the things that teachers are displaying. They're displaying the hypervigilance. They're displaying a sense of hopelessness. They're displaying an inability to embrace complexity. One year, several years ago, the legislators of Pennsylvania introduced 51 pieces of education legislation. It was to the point where, because I do education advocacy for the NAACP, I had to say to some of them, quit. I have to read all this stuff and protect people from it. So stop. You know, teachers aren't sleeping. I know a high school where the teachers are afraid to stand in the hall between classes. The kids aren't that bad, but they are traumatized, and so they're in this condition. Teachers are tired, you know. They're missing school, they have physical ailments, and they feel guilty. And guilt is not always the best thing to feel, especially when you're feeling guilty about something you have absolutely no control over. Like the fact that you didn't realize that so-and-so was going on in Johnny's life, you know. So there are some other terms for STS. Some people call it compassion fatigue, and that term is used so that we don't have to say secondary trauma, but it's the same thing. Vicarious trauma. Now, burnout isn't necessarily used to describe the effects of indirect trauma exposure, but it is a very physical condition. I had burnout one year, and it started with my eyelid twitching. If your eyelid's twitching, see your doctor. And then my neck was stiff, you know. I had 32 students, and 26 of them had active psychological files. Oh, yeah. And I was not in a poor urban school. I was in a college town. The incomes were stable, and they were middle-class kids. So the one thing, when we do work from TIEC or NAA, we make sure people understand this is not an issue by race or ethnicity. 60-some% of the nation's children have been identified as trauma-influenced by then Attorney General Holder, who went across the country in defense of childhood doing this research. So who's at greatest risk? We have, or we knew in 2014 that we had like 3.1 million teachers, and that most of them, 76% of them, were women, and most of them are white women. And 44% were under the age of 40, 56% of them had master's degrees. Teachers are pretty well educated in this country. They'll get this when you talk to them about it. So the most at risk are women. I don't know how we get acculturated to bear the burden of human emotion, but it tends to be a common thing that we are at greatest risk for STS. Highly empathetic, unresolved personal trauma, and there's a lot of that in the teaching profession. If you look at the profession's own research about who we are that go into teaching, you'll see a lot of us have that unresolved trauma. Lots of a heavy caseload. You know, 22 to 32 kids an hour, 6 hours a day. That's a heavy caseload. Whether they're the same 32 or whether you're in middle school and high school. Professional, socially or organizationally isolated. Now, if you think about elementary school, mostly the teacher goes in her room, she's in there, she does what she does, she might come out for lunch if she has time, and then she goes home. So she's socially isolated. And then in the last decade or so, we've had a lot of people who had access to the classroom as teachers who were not really adequately trained. And they don't stay, they can't. So when you're dealing with these children who are so wounded from whatever source of their wounds, teachers may re-experience their own unresolved traumas. You know how that gets stirred up. And then we start withdrawing, avoiding issues. We have a change in our perceptions, and we misread situations. We can't make judicious decisions. We begin to feel inadequate, physically drained. We don't trust the system. We don't trust the people in the building. We don't feel safe because trauma is a medical condition. So we're at higher risk of attrition. In a time when research is saying the people who've been there the longest are highly needed because they have skill sets, we're having to leave because we just can't do it anymore. So we need early detection. We need to be aware that we have to have self-care, and we need to detect when what's happening to us is this medical issue that we call trauma. There is no policy on supervision of educators as it pertains to our secondary trauma. There's really no self-care plan for educators, and we need to have that. We really need to be aware, and we need to have that. So we're just left to go to the lunchroom and switch and trade war stories. And there's no healing in it, but sometimes there's a good belly laugh in the most ridiculous of it, and laughter is rather healing. It gives us enough to keep going. But we do need structured healing supports. So now in Pennsylvania, and this is where I don't know about across the country, and every state has its own laws pertaining to education. But here, policy comes out of the House or the Senate Ed Committee, or it can come out of the State Board of Education. So if you're looking for policy changes, there's where you gotta go. So I believe there needs to be policy in professional development. I believe we need policy that requires systematic, specific, and ongoing professional development for educators. And I believe that policy ought to require the bulleted items here. How the teacher-student relationship may lead to secondary trauma. Teachers need to know and understand that so they can watch for it. The symptoms, so that you will know when you're suffering. We don't always know when we're suffering, we just keep going. We need to know and understand how trauma impedes overall school performance, our relationships with other teachers, our relationship with students, the students' relationships with each other, the students' relationship with accessing the curriculum, our capacity to deliver instruction. It's all impeded by trauma. And so we need a self-care plan. For professional care, we have no required periodic self-assessment or professional assessment of our well-being. And this professional quality of life measure, you can go online and print it out and take it. And some of us might go right to the doctor after we fill it out. We need to restructure teacher preparation programs. And this is something that TIEC and Cheney University and the NAACP are working on now, our recommendations to the Commission on Higher Ed for restructuring teacher ed programs, because anyone going into the profession today must have critical course on trauma, must have a critical course on cultural competency. We worked with a group of teachers about 2 weeks ago. We had a little summit there to ask the grassroots warriors, what do you need in order to have trauma-informed systems in your districts? And they said, well, everybody coming in really needs to be prepared for culturally competent, trauma-informed practice. And so we've gotten that from about 10 school districts, and so we think that's probably pretty true. We called in the ones we knew that had the highest demands of poverty and violence and chaos and so forth. School counselors need the same shift in their preparation programs. School counselors not only are not trained in the energies of trauma, they are not trained to do the screening. We couldn't find, we did a little research, TIEC, a few years ago. We sent out to about, 100 school districts and said, do you have a trauma response? Or do you have any sort of systems in your school to deal with psychological and emotional trauma? And they wrote back and said, well, we just have special education programs, which meant they weren't aware of what we were talking about. I called the then Secretary of Education to meet on the issue, and she had no idea what I was talking about. She said, I thought you meant head trauma. I said, no, no. So, people do need to be informed. Now, policy needs and student services. We need regulations that require us and set adequate service ratios for guidance counselors, social workers. The state of Pennsylvania does not require guidance counselors and social workers in the state law, and that's why Philadelphia could fire most of them and bring a few back. And so we need that policy change. We need it as a part of policy in Pennsylvania that these people are required. And then we need to have policy that lowers the school nurse-student ratio. A school nurse can no longer be responsible for 1,500 kids.